Not every intelligence is born to save the world. Some intelligences simply see too clearly, and sometimes that clarity arrives earlier than a human being's capacity to endure it. What you think you know about Oppenheimer may be wrong. If you are waiting for a story about a bomb, about a flash of light tearing open the desert sky, or about the moment a war was brought to an end by absolute force, then perhaps you are standing before the wrong door, because this story does not begin with metal, uranium, or cold calculations. It starts with a far quieter question. What happens when human intelligence moves faster than human morality? J. Robert Oppenheimer was not born into poverty. He did not grow up amid violence or deprivation. On the contrary, his childhood was wrapped in art, knowledge, and an almost complete sense of protection. A brilliant, sensitive child, taught how to think, but never taught how to confront the darkness of the world, and never taught how to live with the intensity of his own emotions. There are people who begin as ordinary beings, then are driven into darkness by adversity, worn down by time, and finally rise through some concrete form of strength. But Oppenheimer was different. He was not forced to become strong. He was forced to see the structure of nature, to see the boundless potential of science, and very early on, to see the doors that once opened can never be closed again. This is not a story of good or evil, nor is it a story of heroes or villains. It is the story of a moment when intelligence awakens too early, while the rest of humanity is still asleep. In this series, by Deep Sleep of Power, we invite you to slow down, not to conclude, not to judge, only to listen to a life that inadvertently placed the entire world at a new crossroads. If you find stillness in historical stories told at the pace of a quiet breath, stay with us, and if you can, support the channel, so that stories like these may continue to be whispered through the night. And now, while the light has not yet had time to rise, let us begin where everything seemed most harmless of all. A young mind, untouched by violence, unaware of what it would one day awaken. If there is something strange in the story of J. Robert Oppenheimer, it is this. His tragedy did not begin with deprivation. It started with abundance. Not the ostentatious abundance of wealth, but a subtler kind. The privilege of knowledge, the calm of a family that could afford time, space, and even silence. A childhood that did not require fleeing, defending oneself, or learning hardness in order to survive. His early years were placed inside a velvet-lined box, beautiful, safe, and sealed so tightly that the roar of the world could barely penetrate it. Imagine New York at the dawn of the 20th century. Streets still carried the scent of iron and steam. Buildings rose day by day, declarations of the industrial age made of stone and steel. Yet inside the Oppenheimer household, the rhythm of life was different, slower, cleaner, arranged like a library. Conversations turned to art, to books, to things worth thinking about. There was a belief that intelligence itself was a form of morality. That understanding, by its very nature, would make a person better, and within that atmosphere, young Robert grew like a seedling nourished by light. He was sensitive, quietly sensitive, not the kind that bursts into tears or demands attention, but the kind that makes a child feel the world is too much. Too many colors, too many sounds, too many layers of meaning are hidden behind an ordinary sentence. Some children run across the yard and forget everything else. Robert, by contrast, seemed to carry a mirror with him at all times, and in that mirror, Everything reflected a little more deeply than usual. Perhaps that is why he loved books, not as a pastime, but as a refuge. Thin pages could do what real life could not. They allowed him to enter the world without being touched by it. There, he could engage with ideas without encountering violence. He could observe without bearing consequences. And this is the first crucial point. A point that history would later see more clearly. A childhood untouched by violence is not always a blessing. Sometimes it is a postponement of learning how to endure, a delay in learning how to defend oneself, a postponement of learning how to stand firm when the world begins to demand more than intelligence alone. During those years, Robert was not trained to become ruthless. No one taught him that truth is not always gentle. No one said that intelligence can become a blade if it falls into the right hands of power. He was taught that science was a beautiful journey: question, discovery, understanding, progress. A gentle, straight line leading toward the light. But history is not a straight line, and power is not gentle. There is a striking contrast if one places Oppenheimer beside Newton. Newton grew up in the absence of affection, without support, without even a sense of safety. That lack drove him to seek order as a form of armor. Order in mathematics, order in motion, order in the universe. He built a world where everything obeyed laws because his own life had been too chaotic. Oppenheimer moved in the opposite direction. He grew up within a layer of protection so thick that the world never had the chance to frighten him. But precisely because of this, he lacked something many acquire early on: an instinctive recognition of darkness. You might imagine it like someone who grows up in a room always lit by warm lamps. They do not know how heavy darkness can be. They do not know how cold can sink into the bones. They do not know that in some places in the world, a wrong decision is not merely a lesson, but an irreversible loss. Robert was shielded from impact, and as a result, a particular kind of fragility formed within him. Not fragility born of weakness, but fragility born of never having been tested. That fragility sometimes resembles refinement, but under pressure, it can become a crack. At home, everything could be explained. At school, everything could be understood. In books, everything could be controlled by turning a page. But out there, in real life, there are things that cannot be explained, cannot be understood, and cannot be controlled. There are pains that arrive without warning. There are wars that begin without an apparent reason. There are machines of power that operate without the consent of conscience. And the boy Robert at the beginning of this journey did not yet know this. He was intelligent, and perhaps he understood early on that he was different, but that difference did not bring him stability. It got a soft kind of loneliness, the loneliness of someone who sees more but does not know what to do with what he sees. He could answer his teacher's questions, but not the question within himself. Where do I belong? Who will I be when I am no longer the smart child? This is where the story begins to weave an excellent thread, a thread that will stretch all the way to the desert of Los Alamos. For when an intelligence grows up in calm, it often believes that the world itself can be repaired by reason. And when the world refuses to be repaired, that person begins to feel anger. Not anger directed at anyone in particular, but anger toward a reality that feels irrational. In childhood, that anger has no shape yet. It is only a gentle wave beneath the surface, a restlessness, a vague sense of standing before something vast that has not yet been named. Perhaps this is why, in adulthood, Oppenheimer did not become a cold, distant genius. He became a genius both razor-sharp and deeply vulnerable, a man who could speak of the most difficult equations, yet be profoundly affected by intensely human things: a glance, a word, recognition, rejection. In this part, we need not delve too deeply into events. It is enough to understand this. Oppenheimer was shaped by an environment without violence. And because of that, he grew up with a naive belief that knowledge was enough, that understanding could protect itself, that intelligence could pass through history without being wounded by history. That belief was beautiful, like a candle, but it was also as fragile as a candle. And then when the first wind arrives, not from war, but from the internal misalignment within him, we will see what happens when the mind runs too fast, while the heart has not yet learned how to keep pace. The next part of the story will no longer be about calm. It will be the moment when a genius begins to feel out of step with ordinary people. And as the night deepens, we will enter part 3, where we touch a quiet yet decisive truth. A prodigy is not always a blessing. Sometimes it is a misalignment, intelligence moving ahead, and emotion struggling to follow. There is a tranquil moment in the lives of those called prodigies. It is not the moment of praise, not the moment of high scores or admiring glances. It is the moment they realize that the speed within them does not match the rhythm of others. For J. Robert Oppenheimer, that moment came early, too early. His mind moved so quickly that the world around him began to feel slow. Questions others were still forming, he had already passed through and left behind. Problems his peers needed time to grasp were, for him, only brief stopping points. That quickness in the eyes of adults was a gift, but to him, it gradually became a soft form of isolation, not loud, not dramatic, but prolonged and deeply absorbing, because emotion does not move as fast as intellect. Emotion needs time. It needs minor collisions, misunderstandings, wounds that cannot be explained by reason. But Oppenheimer moved through his youth without fully encountering these things. His mind was always ahead, like someone running too fast through a foggy night, only to turn back and realize he had been alone for quite some time. Some people grow by colliding with the world. He grew by observing it. That observation was subtle and sharp, and also risky, because when you grow accustomed to viewing everything from a distance, you begin to believe you can control it. You can name it, classify it, place it into a rational model. But emotion resists being placed into models. It pushes back. It spills over. It disturbs the dark corners that intellect would rather not see. And in Oppenheimer, this misalignment became increasingly apparent. He could grasp the most complex ideas in physics, yet he stumbled in the most human interactions. A minor criticism could haunt him for days. A look of disapproval could draw him into silence, not because he was weak, but because his emotions had never been trained to keep pace with his intellect. Prodigies are often taught how to solve problems. They are rarely taught how to endure. And so, when pressure appeared, not academic pressure, but inner pressure, Oppenheimer had no tools to handle it. He did not know how to slow down. He did not know how to remain still in discomfort. He knew only how to keep thinking, keep analyzing, keep moving faster, as if speed itself could leave behind whatever was causing him pain. But emotion is not left behind. It is only compressed. At some point, that compression began to generate tension, a kind of tension invisible from the outside. He was still the brilliant student, still the name that inspired expectation, but inside, Something had slipped off axis, a vague sense of living in a body that had not yet grown to match the mind within it. You might imagine this like a machine designed to run at great speed, but with an incomplete cooling system. At first, it functions perfectly. Over time, heat builds up. There's nowhere for it to escape. And then all it takes is a slight change, a new pressure, a new environment, for everything to begin to tremble. For Oppenheimer, that trembling did not come from the outside. It came from the phase mismatch between two parts of himself, the part that knew too much and the part that had not yet learned how to feel. This is what makes his story distinctive. If intellect and emotion develop together, genius can become grounded. But if intellect races too far ahead, emotion must chase after it in exhaustion, and in that pursuit, it may stumble. Perhaps this is why Oppenheimer never became a cold, unfeeling genius. He felt intensely, but his emotions arrived late, and often came in waves without warning. When they came, he did not know where to place them. He did not know how to name them. He did not know how to deal with them, except by retreating again into thought, into reason, into familiar structures. Yet there are things that refuse to remain confined within structure. The faster he moved, the more he felt the world could not keep up with him. And when the world fails to keep up, a person has two choices: slow down or become isolated. At this stage, Oppenheimer had not yet learned how to slow down. He began to feel that he did not belong, not exactly excluded, but slightly out of step with the shared circle. Ordinary conversations became difficult. Simple pleasures grew faint. Meanwhile, larger thoughts, abstract questions, drew him ever farther away. This was not a tragedy in a dramatic sense. There were no screams, no visible collapse, only a quiet exhaustion of emotion, trying to keep pace with an intellect that did not know how to stop. And here, an important seed was planted, the seed of later crises. When a person becomes accustomed to solving everything with the mind, they begin to believe that every problem has a solution, even moral problems, even questions of consequence, even choices that may alter the lives of millions. But emotion, when unheard, does not disappear. It waits for a context powerful enough to rise to the surface. And that context was drawing near. In the next part, Oppenheimer would enter an environment where intellect was no longer an absolute advantage, where he would face failure not on paper, but in his own hands, where a genius would, for the first time, feel, perhaps, I do not belong here. As the night deepens a little more, and the breath grows slower, we will follow him to Harvard, a place where knowledge comes easily, but where the self has not yet had time to form. Harvard was not the place that tested J. Robert Oppenheimer's intellect. It was the place that revealed another kind of absence, quieter, harder to name. Stepping onto that venerable campus, Oppenheimer entered a world where knowledge was arranged as neatly as tall library shelves. Every building carries history. Every lecture hall echoed with questions that had once shaken the thinking of generations. Here, intelligence was not rare. What mattered was how that intelligence was used. For Oppenheimer, the absorption of knowledge happened so quickly that it left almost no trace of fatigue. Subjects opened before him like weightless doors. He moved through them with a confident, precise stride, never needing to linger. Lectures were not challenges. They were familiar currents he had learned to swim in long ago. Knowledge came to him not as conquest, but as confirmation. Yes, this is where I belong. But Harvard was more than a repository of learning. It was also a stage where young people tested their roles in the world. Some found themselves through debate. Others matured through conflict. Some first collided with their own limits, and from that collision learned how to stand more firmly. Oppenheimer was different. He absorbed everything, except the self. Because the self does not come from understanding quickly, it comes from enduring error, enduring rejection, enduring questions that cannot be answered immediately. And at Harvard, Oppenheimer rarely had to endure these things. His intelligence smoothed every path. It spared him the necessary stumbles that many others require in order to discover who they are. There is a quiet paradox here. When everything comes too easily, it becomes difficult to know where one truly stands. Oppenheimer could speak about literature, philosophy, and physics with equal sharpness. But when the conversation moved away from knowledge and touched the human, raw emotions and ambiguous choices, he became cautious, as if there were an invisible boundary he was unaccustomed to crossing. He absorbed ideas, but not collisions. He understood the world through reason, but had not yet truly lived within it. At Harvard, this could easily be mistaken for maturity. A young student, composed, broadly knowledgeable, careful in speech. Yet beneath that calm surface, something remained unresolved. He had never been forced to define himself. When intellect does too much of the work, the self has no chance to form naturally. Those years passed in a steady rhythm. Oppenheimer studied, read, thought, and exchanged ideas. He was highly regarded, recognized, but that recognition came from the outside, from professors, from institutions, not from an inner sense of solidity. And because of that, it did not bring lasting peace. On some nights, as the Harvard campus sank into silence, Oppenheimer was left alone with himself, not in an apparent loneliness, but in a subtle emptiness, a sense that he was accumulating many things without knowing what they were meant for, that he was moving very quickly, yet uncertain where the path was leading. At this stage, a trait begins to emerge that would follow him throughout his life. He did not seek power, but he had not yet learned how to keep his distance from it. He did not harbor ambitions of domination, but he held a quiet belief that if one understood enough, if one could see far enough, one might help the world avoid great mistakes. That belief sounds modest, yet within it lies a dangerous assumption that intellect can occupy a neutral position, untouched by consequence. Harvard inadvertently nurtured this assumption. Here, knowledge was often separated from outcome. Ideas were discussed in safe spaces, where every error was hypothetical, every consequence theoretical. And Oppenheimer, accustomed to a mind that ran ahead of emotion, felt at ease in such a world. But that comfort was also a cocoon. Beyond Harvard, the world was changing. Political tensions simmered. Clouds of conflict began to gather over Europe. Science, once imagined as neutral, was being drawn into larger questions. Who would use it, and for what purpose? Oppenheimer had not yet faced those questions directly, but the seeds were planted. An intellect trained to absorb everything, without a self defined enough to say no. A man who understood the structures of knowledge deeply, yet had never been compelled to confront his own limits. Harvard gave him much: knowledge, prestige, and intellectual confidence. But it also left behind a void he would later feel keenly when he entered harsher environments, because not every place allows understanding alone to be enough. And when Oppenheimer left Harvard, carrying the equipment of a brilliant intellect, untempered by failure, he stepped into a different world, a world where theory no longer stands alone, where the hands are required to keep pace with the mind, where misalignment is no longer a concept, but a lived experience. As the night settles a little deeper, we will follow him to Cambridge, where a genius would, for the first time, feel that he did not belong. There are places in a person's life where intellect alone is no longer enough to provide shelter. Cambridge was such a place for J. Robert Oppenheimer. If Harvard was a space where knowledge could be absorbed gently, Cambridge was where knowledge demanded the presence of the hands. Here, ideas were not merely spoken, they had to be tested, not simply written down. They had to withstand the experiment. And it was here that, for the first time in his life, Oppenheimer felt a new sensation with unmistakable clarity. Not belonging, not a lack of intelligence, not a lack of understanding, but a lack of fit. In the cold, brightly lit laboratories, where metal instruments stood in rows like uncompromising questions, Oppenheimer found himself out of rhythm. His hands were clumsy. The repeated precision demanded by experimental work made him tense. Minor errors became large reminders. His mind soared high, but his body could not keep pace. For many people, this would have been merely an adjustment, a skill to be further trained. But for Oppenheimer, it touched something far more profound. From an early age, he had been accustomed to intellect clearing the path, accustomed to understanding more quickly than others. And now, for the first time, that intellect could not carry him forward. Cambridge did not only test ability, it tested identity. When a person builds their sense of self around understanding, even a small failure can strike at the core of how they exist. Oppenheimer was not simply failing an experiment. He was failing to maintain the image he believed he had to embody, the image of someone who always belonged here. There were evenings, after long hours of demanding work, when he left the laboratory with a feeling of emptiness, not anger toward science, but anger toward himself. That anger found no address. It did not know where to go. And when emotion has no outlet, it often turns inward. At Cambridge, the misalignment between intellect and emotion, already present, began to grow painful. His mind remained sharp, even sharper than before. But each time his hands failed to respond, each time a mistaken movement caused results to collapse, a quiet voice surfaced. Perhaps I do not belong here. It was a dangerous sentence, not because it was true or false, but because it gnawed. Oppenheimer began to fall into states of tension he had never known before. Nameless anxieties, sleepless nights, prolonged moments of self-questioning. For a mind accustomed to speed, being forced to slow down through failure was a harsh experience. And because he had never learned how to live with emotion, those emotions became more intense than necessary. There is something subtle here. Oppenheimer did not hate experimentation. He hated not being able to master it. He hated the feeling of being constrained by the body, by skill, by small details that could not be ignored. For someone used to living in the world of ideas, the material world can feel suffocating. And so, within the space of Cambridge, a quiet conflict unfolded, not between a man and science, but between two modes of existence, the thinker and the doer. Oppenheimer leaned entirely toward the former, but this environment did not permit that. This sense of not fitting was not merely an obstacle. It was a psychological shock. It forced him to confront a truth he had never before faced, that intellect, no matter how brilliant, is not always enough, that there are spaces not meant for everyone. and that admitting this is far more painful than trying to adapt. During these months, Oppenheimer grew more sensitive, more easily wounded. Even small remarks could preoccupy him for days. A single failure, however limited, could be magnified in his mind, not because he was weak, but because he was operating within an environment incompatible with how he functioned. Cambridge, inadvertently, revealed an important truth. Oppenheimer was not a man of the hands. He was a man of conceptual connection. But at this moment, he did not yet know that. He knew only that he was in pain, under strain, and gradually losing his sense of direction. This is the stage at which many geniuses break, not from a lack of ability, but from the inability to find a place to stand. Some give up. Some grow bitter. Some try to force themselves into a mold that does not fit, and pay for it with their mental health. Oppenheimer stood on that threshold, yet precisely here, something important began to take shape, though he did not yet recognize it. This failure was not an end. It was a signal, a whisper suggesting that his path did not lie in doing everything well, but in doing what was right for him. Cambridge gave him his first experience of psychological collapse. But from that collapse, a new question emerged. If I do not belong here, then where do I belong? That question would not be answered immediately. It required another space, another environment, a place that did not demand the hands to move ahead of the mind, but allowed the mind to breathe. And so, when Oppenheimer left Cambridge, he carried with him not only failure, but a vague longing to find a place where he would not have to struggle to become someone else. In the next part, we will follow him to Göttingen, a space where theory is allowed to stand at the center, where Oppenheimer would, for the first time, feel that he had returned to his proper place. There are storms that do not come from the outside. They form slowly, deeply, and only one person feels the weight of them. After Cambridge, Oppenheimer carried no visible wounds. There was no accident, no public failure, no clear marker for history to underline with a brief dash. Yet inside him, something had slipped decisively off axis, like a small chipped gear, causing the entire machine to vibrate in silence. His crisis did not erupt. It smoldered. From an early age, Oppenheimer had learned to conceal emotion beneath intellect. Whenever he did not understand what he was feeling, he thought more. Whenever he was in pain, he analyzed the pain. Whenever he felt anger, he questioned its causes. It was an effective way to exist, until it was no longer effective. At Cambridge, the feeling of not belonging awakened something he had never before been forced to face. Emotions that are suppressed do not disappear. They accumulate, they wait, and when there is no outlet, they seek another way to express themselves. Oppenheimer became more easily agitated, not loudly but wearily, a muted irritability, a nameless restlessness, a sense that anything could become overwhelming in an instant. His anger was not directed at anyone in particular. It had no object, no target, and thus it became violence without an address. When people are not taught where to place their emotions, they often put them within themselves. Oppenheimer began to blame himself, to doubt himself, to tear apart the image he had once trusted. Thoughts spun in circles like an experiment that never yields stable results. He could read, he could write, he could speak about grand ideas, but he could not soothe a small knot of tension within himself. There were nights when sleep would not come, not because he was too busy, but because his mind refused to shut down. It ran continuously, as if stopping would allow something dangerous to rise from behind. And indeed, something was waiting there. The fear that he had chosen wrongly, that he did not belong on this path, that his intellect, rather than being a key, might be becoming a burden. Here we touch upon a brutal truth. Genius is not immune to psychological crisis. In many cases, it is even more vulnerable, because geniuses see more, anticipate more, and therefore carry more, often alone. At this stage, Oppenheimer was no longer confronting the question, "Am I good enough?" That question had long been answered. He was facing a deeper, more frightening one. Who am I when intellect can no longer protect me? This crisis was not a total collapse. It was more like a crack running along the inside, a crack that made everything more fragile without making a sound. He continued to study, continued to present himself to others with a calm exterior, but with each passing day, maintaining that calm consumed more energy. And when energy runs low, people begin to seek imperfect exits. Oppenheimer tried to cling to discipline, to reason, to the familiar structures of thought. But those structures, designed to solve scientific problems, were not flexible enough to hold a turbulent inner state. They were rigid, sharp, and when used to force emotion into shape, the one most often injured is the one applying the force. Violence without an address, therefore, requires no outward action. It exists as a constant pressure, making everything around it sharper than usual. A word can be misinterpreted. A glance can be magnified. A small failure can become proof of a negative belief that has been quietly growing for a long time. Here, we begin to see a pattern that would follow Oppenheimer into his later years of power. When pushed into stress, he did not explode outward. He collapsed inward, and that inward collapse created another kind of danger. It trained him to endure without release. But no one can endure forever. An inner crisis, when left unnamed, will attempt to name itself. It may appear as anxiety, as withdrawal. Extreme behaviors are unrecognizable from the person's usual self, not because the person has changed, but because they are trying to survive a storm no one else can see. Oppenheimer stood very close to that boundary, and perhaps because he was so close to it, he began to sense a new need, one born not of ambition, but of survival. The need for a different space, a place where intellect was not forced to prove itself through the hands, a place where thought was allowed to move ahead of action, a place where he could breathe. Crisis, in its most profound sense, is not merely collapse. It is a signal that an old structure no longer fits, and if a person is fortunate enough, or alert enough, they will hear that signal before it is too late. For Oppenheimer, this inner crisis did not destroy him. It redirected him. In the next part, we will see what happens when an intellect exhausted by being placed in the wrong environment finally finds a space aligned with its true nature. A place that does not require him to become someone else. A place that allows him to do what he does best, connect ideas rather than battle himself. As the rhythm of the night settles, we will step with him into Göttingen, where, for the first time in many years, Oppenheimer can breathe deeply and feel that he has returned to the actual tempo of his mind. There are places that do not make a person greater. They do something far simpler. They allow a person to breathe at their own rhythm. Göttingen was such a place for J. Robert Oppenheimer. After the tense months in Cambridge, where every step carried a sense of not fitting, Oppenheimer arrived in Göttingen not as a conqueror of knowledge, but as someone searching for a place to reset his breath. He was not seeking a reputation, not seeking victory. He needed only a space where the mind was allowed to exist without having to defend itself. And here, for the first time in a long while, he felt relief. Göttingen was not loud, not ostentatious. It did not force people to prove themselves through flawless manual skill. Instead, it listened to ideas. Here, theory was not treated as something secondary to experiment. It was placed at the center, as a language of intellect in its own right, where those capable of seeing further were permitted to speak in their own rhythm. For Oppenheimer, it felt like stepping out of a sealed room to take in a breath of cold, clean air. His mind, long exhausted from constant tension, began to loosen. Thoughts that had been compressed were now allowed to flow naturally, without proof, without defense. At Göttingen, he no longer had to try to become a skilled experimentalist. He no longer had to force his hands to keep pace with his mind. He was allowed to be himself, a connector of ideas, someone who saw relationships between concepts that appeared unrelated. Someone capable of hearing the deeper rhythms of scientific thought. And precisely when he was no longer forced to fit, Oppenheimer began to shine. There is a very human paradox here. When people are placed in the correct position, they do not need to strive excessively. They do not need to strain to prove their worth. They simply exist, and from that existence, aligned with their natural rhythm, value emerges on its own. At Göttingen, Oppenheimer rediscovered this feeling. He conversed, he debated, he listened, and more importantly, he connected, not in a way that dominated, but in a way that expanded. Each exchange was not meant to affirm the self, but to clarify a larger shared structure. This was what he had always done best, and what Cambridge had not allowed him to do. This change did not arrive as an explosion. It came slowly, steadily, like breathing that settles after a panic. Sleepless nights became less frequent. Inner tensions softened, not because the problems vanished, but because he was no longer facing them alone. At Göttingen, Oppenheimer was no longer out of step. He became part of an intellectual ecosystem where each person contributed according to their true strengths. And within that ecosystem, he learned an important lesson, even if he did not yet fully recognize it. Strength does not always come from doing everything, but from placing the right person in the correct position. This lesson would later become the most significant mark of his role. But at this moment, it was simply a new sense of safety, a feeling that he no longer had to battle himself, that his intellect was not a burden to be hidden, but a rhythm that was accepted. It can be said that Göttingen did not fully heal Oppenheimer, but it prevented him from continuing to injure himself. It gave him the necessary quiet to reorganize his inner fragments, to realize that the crisis he had just endured was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of having been in the wrong place. And within that quiet, a new image of himself slowly emerged. Oppenheimer was not the creator of the most dazzling breakthroughs. He was not the one who tunneled a single path to its deepest end. He was the one who stood at intersections, who saw the larger picture, who understood that knowledge advances not through solitary geniuses, but through networks of people who know how to listen to one another. This realization was subtle. It did not bring an immediate sense of power, but it planted a lasting seed, the seed of coordination, of connection, of someone who could stand among many brilliant minds without needing to be the best in the room. At Göttingen, Oppenheimer did not need to be the best. He needed only to be the most fitting. And when a person finds that fit, they begin to see the world differently, less defensively, less fearfully, and therefore more open to larger questions, not only of science but of society. At this time, the world was not yet demanding that Oppenheimer make choices, but the foundations for future decisions were beginning to form. He learned to view science as a collective effort. He learned to trust that intellect, when properly organized, could create changes far beyond the capacity of any single individual. Göttingen was not a summit. It was a point of balance, and from that balance, Oppenheimer would move forward, no longer as an intellect out of step, but as someone who understood his role more clearly within a rapidly expanding scientific world. In the next part, we will see what happens when that balance begins to generate more durable structures, when Oppenheimer not only finds space to breathe, but also lays the first stones for an approach to science that would have a lasting influence. As the night moves a little further on, to where unglamorous discoveries become the foundations for journeys that travel very far, approximation and truths larger than fame. There are contributions that do not make history pause to applaud. They are quieter, more modest, and for that very reason, it is often far more enduring. At Göttingen, once Oppenheimer's breathing had returned to its proper rhythm, he began to do what he did best, not to produce a dazzling breakthrough, but to lay foundations that would allow others to go farther. This was not the path of immediate glory. It was the path of structure, and structure, once it stands firm, can support an entire generation. In the young world of quantum mechanics, everything trembled. Elegant equations often collided with the complex realities of atoms and molecules. What was needed was a new approach, not perfect, but workable, not absolute, but accurate enough to keep thinking alive. And in that gap, a profoundly human idea emerged: approximation. Approximation does not promise complete truth. It promises only a safe step forward. Oppenheimer understood this with deep intuition, perhaps because his inner life, too, was a sequence of approximations. He did not seek emotional perfection. He sought a balance sufficient to continue living and working. And so, when facing scientific problems, he was not obsessed with absolute precision. He cared about usability, whether a model could help others understand and move forward. The approximation that bore his name was not a grand declaration. It did not change the world overnight, but it achieved something more important. It opened a path. It allowed scientists not to become trapped in detail, to glimpse a larger picture without sacrificing necessary rigor. Here, we touch upon a profound truth of science and of humanity itself. Not all progress comes from leaps. Most of it comes from small bridges, spanning gaps that once seemed impossible to cross. And those bridges rarely carry the names of their builders. Oppenheimer was not troubled by this, at least not at this stage. He was not hunting for prizes. He was not trying to carve his name into solitary peaks. What mattered to him was the shared current, whether science could continue to move forward, whether other minds could use this work as a foothold to go on. There was a quiet maturity in this approach. It showed that Oppenheimer had moved beyond the need to prove himself through visible milestones. He began to believe that actual value lay not in being named, but in being used, an idea that is applied, expanded, and carried forward in the hands of others. That is lasting success. At this moment, from the outside, Oppenheimer might have appeared to be a scientist lacking sensational achievements. But looking more closely, we see that he was doing something far more difficult, building foundations in an unstable world. And building foundations requires a kind of humility that not every genius possesses. Nobel, the symbol of recognition, measures a particular kind of contribution. It favors discoveries that are clear, bounded, and momentous. But science does not advance only through moments. It advances through phases. And in those phases, the role of those who organize thought, who provide structure, who make other people's ideas workable, often remains unseen. At Göttingen, Oppenheimer accepted that role naturally, not because he knew he would never receive a Nobel, but because he understood, with rare maturity, that not every critical truth needs to be framed by a medal. Truths greater than Nobel are truths of influence. An idea, however modest, if placed correctly, can generate chains of reaction that last for decades. And Oppenheimer began to see science in this way, as an interconnected system where each small contribution can be amplified if positioned well. Here, an essential line in his portrait becomes clearer. He was not someone who sought to stand at the center of the spotlight. He stood at the center of the network. He connected scattered points. He understood that strength lies not in a single, bright point, but in how points of light are linked together. This understanding would later become the key to roles far greater. Roles no longer purely scientific, but touching power, organization, and responsibility. Yet at this moment, it still bore the gentle shape of an academic choice, to build foundations rather than towers. And perhaps because he chose to build foundations, Oppenheimer learned a deeply human lesson. Not all value needs to be seen immediately. Some values reveal themselves only when the world has traveled far enough to recognize what it has been standing on all along. Approximation is not perfect, but it is good enough to continue. And sometimes, good enough is precisely what allows people to keep moving forward in a complex world, without being paralyzed by the demands of perfection. When this phase came to a close, Oppenheimer did not carry with him a great title, but he had something more precious: intellectual credibility, the trust of his peers, and an increasingly clear identity: the teacher, the connector, the one who made science a dialogue rather than a race. In the next part, we will see that identity continues to expand when Oppenheimer begins not only to build foundations with ideas, but with people. When he steps into a role he never planned for himself, yet one that fits him with uncanny precision. As the night settles a little deeper, influence is measured not by summits reached, but by the doors opened for others to step through. There are people who enter history by conquering, and there are people who leave their mark by opening paths. J. Robert Oppenheimer belonged to the second group, even though for many years he himself never named it as such. After Göttingen, as quiet approximations began to take effect, Oppenheimer started to appear in the scientific world in a very different way. He did not stand at the center proclaiming truth. He stood slightly to the side, just far enough to see in more than one direction, just far enough to listen to the different voices taking shape. This was the moment a new identity slowly emerged: the teacher. Not the teacher in the sense of authority, not the one standing on a high platform, dispensing knowledge like commands, but the rarer kind of teacher, the one who makes others dare to think, dare to ask, and dare to go farther than themselves. Oppenheimer did not teach through absolute certainty. He taught through open questions, through silences placed at the right moment, through acknowledging that there were things no one fully understood yet, and precisely for that reason, they were worth thinking through together. In the discussion, he did not seek to win. He sought to connect, to link one idea to another, one person to another, a young, tentative thought to a structure strong enough for it to stand. There was a very particular strength in this kind of guidance. It did not overwhelm. It did not make others feel small. On the contrary, it made them feel invited. And when people feel invited, they tend to commit more deeply, more sincerely. Oppenheimer understood this, perhaps because he himself had once been out of step, had once needed a space to breathe. He did not want science to become a contest of exclusion. He wanted it to be an ongoing dialogue, where each person could contribute in their own way. In these years, he did not tunnel into science along a single depth. He did not cling to one topic and conquer it to the end, regardless of everything else. Instead, he opened doors. He led students toward new intellectual territories, showed them connections, possibilities, directions left unexplored. Then he stepped back, allowing them to walk on their own. This was not the fastest way to make a name, but it was the way to create lasting influence. A conqueror leaves behind territory. A teacher leaves behind people. Oppenheimer began to see value in the influence of this kind. He did not need to be the most intelligent person in the room. He needed only to be the one who made the room smarter when everyone was together. And once again, this reflected his inner life with striking clarity. A man who did not seek domination, but did not shy away from responsibility either. Perhaps that is why students came to him not only to learn knowledge, but to learn how to think, how to ask questions, how to live with uncertainty without panic. Oppenheimer did not give them ready-made answers. He gave them confidence that their questions were worth pursuing. In the slow cadence of deep sleep of power, this is a crucial point, because power, before it becomes political or military, often begins as intellectual power, and intellectual power does not lie merely in knowing more than others. It lies in shaping how others think. Oppenheimer, in his role as a teacher, was doing precisely that, quietly. He did not build a school bearing his name. He did not demand loyalty. He allowed disagreement, allowed mistakes, allowed intellectual experimentation. And within that space, many of the 20th century's essential ideas began to germinate, not as inventions with clear signatures, but as shared directions taken by many minds together. But the difference between a teacher and a conqueror is not only one of method, it is one of the motivations. A conqueror needs a summit to stand upon. A teacher needs a generation to hand things over to. And Oppenheimer, even without knowing where the future would lead him, was choosing the second path. This also reveals something deeper about his psychology. After his inner crises, after the feeling of not belonging, he no longer craved victory in a personal sense. He craved meaning, and meaning for him did not come from standing above others, but from helping others stand firm. Yet this very choice, the choice to be a teacher, was also quietly preparing a great paradox. Because someone skilled at connecting people, coordinating intellects, and seeing the larger picture will sooner or later attract the attention of forces larger than pure science. As the world began to tremble with political tension, as science was gradually pulled out of lecture halls and placed onto the board of power, people like Oppenheimer became particularly useful, not because they were aggressive, but because they understood systems, understood people, understood how minds functioned together. At this point, Oppenheimer was still standing within the safe zone of academia, but the lines had been drawn, relationships had formed, his intellectual reputation had spread, and though he had never actively sought politics was slowly approaching him through very human doors, emotion, anxiety, and compassion for a world sliding steadily toward darkness. In the next part, we will see the moment when science is no longer a purely intellectual dialogue, when questions of thought begin to carry the scent of their time, when politics enters the space of science, not through doctrine, but through emotion, as the night deepens a little more, where a teacher begins to realize that not every open door leads to knowledge, and not every invitation can be refused. Politics rarely knocks on the door. It usually enters quietly, through emotion, not through grand slogans, not through fiery manifestos, but through deeply human stories, fear, compassion, a sense of unease before a world slowly slipping out of its familiar orbit. For J. Robert Oppenheimer, this moment did not arrive as a clear-cut choice. It came as diffusion, like the faint smell of smoke in the air before one sees the fire. He did not wake up one morning and decide to enter politics. Politics was already there, in side conversations, in the worried glances of colleagues, in news reports carrying word from a Europe growing darker by the day. The scientific world was accustomed to abstract problems. But now, those problems no longer rested quietly on blackboards. They began attaching themselves to real people, to cities with names, to families with faces, to a future becoming fragile in an unmistakably human way. Oppenheimer was not drawn toward politics by a hunger for power. What pulled him closer was empathy, a deep, almost instinctive empathy of someone who could see too clearly the consequences of leaving intelligence isolated in an ivory tower. He understood that science was no longer a harmless intellectual game. It was becoming a force. And when a force is left without direction, it will find its own path, often not a gentle one. Perhaps because he had endured inner crises himself, Oppenheimer was more sensitive to the anxieties of others. He heard questions that had not yet been spoken. He sensed the tension accumulating beneath the surface of academic conferences. Debates no longer revolved solely around formulas or models. They began to carry another layer of meaning. Where are we headed, and who will bear responsibility if things go too far? At this stage, politics did not ask him to choose sides. It asked only that he care, and caring for someone like Oppenheimer was a door that opened easily. He had never learned indifference. His intellect was always accompanied by a sensitivity that bordered on pain when confronted with potential injustice. The danger here did not lie in intention. It lay in the path. When politics enters through emotion, it does not bring a clear map. It brings vague invitations to help, to protect, to prevent something terrible from happening. And who can refuse such invitations when they are wrapped in the language of moral responsibility? Oppenheimer began to sense himself standing at a new intersection, not between right and wrong, but between silence and involvement. Silence meant preserving academic purity. Involvement meant accepting that science was no longer neutral, and that scientists could no longer stand apart from the consequences of their work. This was not a decision made overnight. It formed gradually, through long conversations, sleepless nights of reflection, through the feeling that turning away would mean losing a part of himself. Oppenheimer did not want to become someone who knew too much and did too little. He did not want his intellect to exist merely as a silent witness. Yet here, a paradox began to surface. When politics enters through emotion, it rarely states the cost up front. It does not emphasize that involvement will blur the boundary between personal responsibility and collective command. It does not warn that choices made under emergency conditions will haunt long after the emergency has passed. At this point, Oppenheimer did not yet see all of that. He saw a task that needed doing, a danger that needed to be prevented, a responsibility that had to be carried. And with the instincts of a connector, he believed that if intelligence could be organized correctly, if the brightest minds could be gathered, then science might be guided toward the least harmful path possible. It was a belief both noble and fragile, because it assumed that good intentions could control vast consequences, and history, as we know, rarely accommodates such assumptions. In the slow cadence of deep sleep of power, this is the moment when the story begins to change color. It is no longer a purely personal journey, no longer an inner development confined to academic space. This is when invisible forces, nations, war, collective fear, begin to touch a specific individual. Oppenheimer was not pulled in by force. He was invited, and that invitation sounded very much like a moral appeal. If not you, then who? If not now, then when? Such questions do not require coercion. They find their own way into those already accustomed to carrying responsibility. Here, we begin to see something that will follow Oppenheimer through the rest of the story. He did not enter power driven by a desire to dominate. He entered out of concern that without someone who could see the whole picture, decisions would be made by those who saw only fragments. But power does not operate on concern. It operates on structure, and once one crosses that threshold, it becomes difficult to return to the original position, where emotion and intellect could still be held within a private, protected space. In the next part, politics will no longer be a set of vague conversations. It will take on a particular scent, the scent of war. When science is no longer asked, is it possible? But how soon? When time begins to compress every choice, and ethics are pushed aside like a secondary variable, as the night deepens, when science begins to smell war, and every question starts to change its voice. War does not always begin with gunfire. Sometimes it begins with a very faint scent, the scent of urgency. No one speaks loudly about it at first. There are no official announcements. Only the rhythm of conversations begins to change. Questions are asked more quickly. Silences grow longer. And somewhere in the air, science begins to sense that it is no longer being asked, is it possible? But increasingly, how soon? For J. Robert Oppenheimer, this was the period when the academic world lost its familiar neutrality. Meeting rooms no longer discuss ideas alone. They discussed time. And when time becomes pressure, ethics are often pushed aside, not because people do not care, but because they believe there is no longer a choice. Science, by its nature, does not carry morality. It carries only capability. That capability can heal. It can also destroy. And it is precisely this cold neutrality that makes science so attractive in times of war. Because war does not seek the right question. It seeks results fast enough. Oppenheimer saw this early, perhaps because he had always been able to see the larger picture. News from Europe was not merely information. It was a signal, a set of fragments revealing a cracking order. And when order fractures, science no longer remains an observer. It is pulled onto the stage as an unwilling protagonist. Discussions grew shorter. Assumptions were trimmed down. Questions of should we were replaced by, can we make it in time? Here, the smell of war did not rise like smoke. It seeped in like an invisible pressure, adding weight to every decision. Oppenheimer was not a man of aggression, but he understood the logic of the moment. He understood that when nations believe they are under threat, they will not wait for moral consensus. They will act. And if science does not participate, it will not remain outside. It will be used in other ways by those far less concerned with long-term consequences. This is the most challenging point in his story. Not a choice between good and evil, but between involvement to retain some control and withdrawal that surrenders all direction. Both paths carry risk, and neither allows one to keep clean hands. When science smells war, it does not panic. It becomes efficient. It cuts away unnecessary questions. It optimizes processes. It concentrates resources. And in doing so, human beings, with their slower emotions, begin to fall behind. Oppenheimer stood at this boundary with a profoundly human concern. The fear that if everything were left to speed alone, the consequences would exceed humanity's capacity to endure. But he also understood that if one slowed down for too long, others would move ahead, perhaps those who cared little about consequences at all. Here, we see clearly that the neutrality of science is a fragile illusion in wartime. Science may have no intention, but it always has consequences. And when those consequences are placed in the hands of power, individual intention becomes secondary. In those days, Oppenheimer began to think more about responsibility, not an abstract responsibility, but a very concrete one. The responsibility of those who see ahead, who sees chains of reaction, who sees points of no return, who considers that once a door is opened, it can never be fully closed again. But seeing is not the same as controlling. The scent of war makes everything urgent. Those once patient grow restless. Scientists who once thrived on debate begin to agree more quickly than usual. Not because they suddenly think alike, but because time no longer permits prolonged disagreement. In this context, Oppenheimer stood out, not as a singular inventor, but as a coordinator, someone who could coordinate speed, coordinate people, coordinate complexity. He did not offer moral answers. He provided the ability to make different minds work together under extreme pressure, and that made him useful, proper, a neutral word. But in wartime, it carries a frightening weight. Because when a person is deemed beneficial to a system, the system will seek to keep them close. Not through threat, but through invitation, through appeals to responsibility, through reminders that if it is not you, it will be someone else. Oppenheimer began to feel that science had left its original space of freedom. It was entering a track, and once on that track, direction was no longer determined by open questions, but by a destination already set. War, here, does not require immediate violence. It needs only to create the feeling that time is running out. And when time runs out, people are willing to accept what they would usually resist. In this slow narration, we can pause here for a moment to see that this is not the climax. It is a transition point, the moment when science ceases to be an observer, the moment when personal responsibility begins to dissolve into collective responsibility, the moment when Oppenheimer, though not yet formally in a position of power, has already started to be seen as part of a larger machine. And once seen that way, the question is no longer whether to participate. The question becomes how much to participate and under what conditions. In the next part, the scent of war will no longer be vague. It will become a very concrete decision, when power does not merely listen to science, but selects a person to stand between science and the state. When that choice is made, science will no longer be as free as before. As the night deepens, to the place where a person is positioned such that there is no path back, at least not without being fundamentally changed. Power rarely asks, "Do you want to?" It usually asks a different question, softer in tone, yet heavier in weight. Are you ready? When the scent of war had become unmistakable, when no one could pretend not to smell it anymore, power began to do what it always does in moments of instability. It chose a person, not the strongest, not the loudest, but the one capable of seeing the entire picture, and of keeping that picture from collapsing immediately. J. Robert Oppenheimer was chosen in precisely this way, not because he was aggressive, not because he craved power, but because he possessed a rare quality, the ability to connect intellects under pressure. Power does not need a solitary genius. It requires someone who can make many geniuses move in the same direction. Someone who understands people, understands conflict, understands the rhythm of thought, and above all, understands time. Because in war, time is the most unforgiving resource. For Oppenheimer, the invitation did not arrive as a blunt command. It came through discreet conversations, through half-spoken sentences, through the feeling that this is what needs to be done, rather than this is what you must do. Power is exceptionally skilled at creating a sense of voluntariness, especially when it places responsibility on the shoulders of those already accustomed to carrying it. Here, we touch upon an uncomfortable truth. Not everyone who is chosen because they want to be. Many are selected because they are the hardest to refuse. Oppenheimer understood that being chosen was not a pure honor. It was a step across a boundary, a step from a world where science could still debate endlessly, into a world where science had to answer particular questions within very narrow time frames. A step from the role of teacher and intellectual coordinator into the role of someone accountable to a larger system, a system that does not operate on academic subtlety, but on command. And once that boundary is crossed, science is no longer as free as it once was. Power did not choose Oppenheimer because he was gentle. It chose him because he could see the whole picture. He saw the branches of research. He saw the different personalities. He saw the latent conflicts that could erupt if left uncoordinated. And Power believed that if anyone could keep all of this from disintegrating under the pressure of war, it would be him. But accompanying that trust was a very quiet trade-off. From this moment on, Oppenheimer's science was no longer his own. It became part of a strategy. Each decision was no longer measured solely by academic correctness, but by effectiveness. Each delay was no longer an option, but a risk. Here, power does not need to strip away freedom immediately. It only needs to shape priorities. Once priorities are set, other choices automatically become unrealistic. Oppenheimer sensed this, even if he could not yet fully name it. He understood that he was stepping into a role where every decision carried weight far beyond the laboratory. Yet he also believed, and this belief was both noble and dangerous, that if he stood at the center, he could reduce the damage, that he could make what was inevitable less devastating. This belief was not naive, but it was fragile, because power does not operate on personal moral assumptions. It operates on objectives, and once an aim is set, everything else begins to orbit around it. Oppenheimer might influence the method, but he could not change the fundamental question: could it be completed in time? The choice of power, therefore, was not a choice between good and evil. It was a choice between control and speed. And in wartime, speed usually wins. At this stage, Oppenheimer was not forced to betray any principle in an obvious way. The shift was more subtle. Meetings grew shorter. Decisions are more decisive. Space for hesitation gradually narrowed. And whenever an ethical question surfaced, it was acknowledged, then set aside, to be discussed later. But later rarely arrives when it is needed. Power did not require Oppenheimer to become someone else. It only required him to place his intellect on a new trajectory. A trajectory where success was defined by task completion, not by inner peace. And Oppenheimer, with all his complexity, accepted this, not because he was blind, but because he believed that if someone who deeply understood consequences did not stand in this position, the consequences would be far worse. This is the pivotal moment of the story. Quiet, without immediate tragedy, but heavy with consequence, because from here on, every advance of science would cast a longer shadow, and that shadow would follow Oppenheimer for the rest of his life. In the slow cadence of deep sleep of power, we can pause here to see clearly. The choice of power does not only shape history, it shapes people. It changes how we think about responsibility, about freedom, about what we are willing to trade in moments of emergency. And once that choice has been made, there is little time left for private reflection. Power does not wait for inner certainty. It waits for action. In the next part, this choice will take on a very concrete form. No longer discreet meetings or vague invitations, but a place, a desert, an isolated space cut off from the world, where intellect is concentrated at its highest intensity, and sleep becomes a luxury. As the night deepens one more beat, where the choice of power begins to turn into reality, and science steps into a point of no return. There are cities not meant to endure. They are built for a single purpose, and then dissolve as if they had never existed. Los Alamos was such a city. It had no history, no central square, no memories layered across generations. It appeared in the desert like an urgent thought, raised by necessity, by fear, and by a fragile belief that intelligence could outrun catastrophe. When Oppenheimer arrived, he did not come as a general, nor as a solitary inventor. He went as a coordinator, the one entrusted with keeping a gathering of extraordinary minds working together inside a space completely cut off from the outside world. Los Alamos was unlike any place he had known, not because it was immediately dangerous, but because it lacked a regular rhythm of life. Here, day and night blurred together. Time was compressed. Clocks still moved, but sleep was no longer an assumed right. Everything revolved around a single question: how to turn capability into reality as quickly as possible. Sleepless minds began to gather. Physicists, mathematicians, engineers, people accustomed to thinking in symbols and models, are now forced to learn how to live together under constant pressure. Oppenheimer stood at the center of this vortex, not as the most brilliant, but as the one who saw the collective's fragility. He understood that genius, when confined within a sealed space, could create miracles, but it could also create conflict, ego, exhaustion. Minor disagreements could swell into major fractures when sleep was taken away. Los Alamos, therefore, was not merely a scientific project. It was a large-scale psychological experiment. Here, Oppenheimer did what he had learned to do early in life: create space for intellect to breathe. Even when the physical space itself was suffocating, he listened, he connected, He extinguished conflicts before they ignited, not through authority, but through an understanding that everyone inside the compound carried a different pressure, a different fear, a different limit. But that very understanding came at a cost, because when you stand in the middle, there is nowhere to hide. You hear everything, you know everything, and you cannot pretend not to understand the consequences of what is unfolding. The equations on the blackboards were no longer intellectual exercises. They began to carry images of distant cities, nameless people, ordinary mornings that could be torn apart in an instant. Los Alamos operated like a machine that never slept, and Oppenheimer was the one who kept that machine from destroying itself. There were nights when the lights in the workrooms still burned, while the desert fell silent. No one spoke much about it. Fatigue became a shared condition, like a thin mist covering every conversation. People talked more briefly, decisions were made more quickly, and gradually questions of "should we" were pushed aside, replaced by "can we make it in time?" Here, one thing becomes clear. When intellect is placed under time pressure, it grows sharper, but colder. Not because people become cruel, but because they no longer have the energy to fully feel every consequence. Emotion, once again, lagged behind the mind. Oppenheimer sensed this misalignment. He knew that Los Alamos was not merely creating a tool. It was creating a precedent. Science could be organized like a military project. That intellect could be isolated, accelerated, and aimed at a single objective. And once such a precedent existed, it would not vanish easily along with this temporary city. But Los Alamos did not allow for prolonged reflection. It demanded total presence. Each day brought a new problem. Each sleepless night marked either a step forward or a step closer to the edge. Oppenheimer was both the keeper of rhythm and the absorber of tension. He could not appear panicked, could not appear hesitant, because any faltering at the center could ripple through the entire system. This was a very particular kind of power. Not the power to command, but the power to keep everything moving. In the slow cadence of the story, Los Alamos appears as a city without dreams. No one here was allowed to dream far ahead. No one was allowed to sleep fully. And because of that, minds grew ever sharper, while hearts grew weary. Oppenheimer began to feel a subtle change within himself. He remained the connector, but now that connection carried the weight of life and death. Each coordinating decision affected not only progress but also the direction of history. And even without an explosion, even without a blinding light over the desert, one thing had already become irreversible. The world had stepped onto a new path. Los Alamos did not need memory. It needed results. And as the sleepless minds drew closer to the final answer, the desert's silence thickened, as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting for the moment when science would no longer be hypothetical. In the next part, Oppenheimer's role will become even more clearly defined. No longer only a connector, but a conductor of genius, someone who made the most brilliant personalities work together without collapsing. As the night stretches a little longer, where strength does not come from being the best in the room, but from making the entire room better. There is a common misconception about intellectual power, that the person at the top must be the smartest in the room. Los Alamos proved the opposite, and Oppenheimer was the living embodiment of that paradox. He was not the most brilliant physicist there, not the fastest at solving equations, not the one with the sharpest intuition in every technical detail, but he was the one who made it possible for those people to coexist within a sealed space, and to keep working. Coordinating geniuses is not like commanding an army. Geniuses do not obey mechanically. They have egos, pride, a fear of being misunderstood, and in a compressed environment like Los Alamos, those elements are more volatile than ever. A single unresolved conflict, left unattended, could fracture the entire system. Oppenheimer understood this with a profoundly human intuition. He did not impose. He adjusted the rhythm. When a dominant personality began to overshadow others, he created space. When an idea was overlooked, he brought it back to the table. When tension escalated, he did not extinguish it with orders. He redirected it with questions. There were debates that stretched late into the night, not to declare winners or losers, but to keep ideas from destroying one another. Oppenheimer rarely concluded on behalf of others. He asked questions at the right moment, sharp enough to force reconsideration, gentle enough that no one felt threatened. This was a subtle form of power, the power of understanding people more than tools. At Los Alamos, each genius carried a private obsession. Some were obsessed with precision, others with speed, others are being right in the eyes of a history. Oppenheimer did not try to erase these obsessions. He placed them where they belonged, like different forces pulling toward a common point. This required enormous mental energy, because the coordinator must listen more than speak, must absorb others' fatigue, must carry tensions no one else wants to hold. When things go well, the credit belongs to the collective. When things falter, eyes turn to the person in the middle. Oppenheimer accepted this, not because he enjoyed responsibility, but because he believed that without someone standing at the center, those sleepless minds would begin to erode one another. There were nights when, after meetings ended, he remained alone with blackboards full of symbols, not to solve another equation, but to rearrange the picture. He saw connections others had not yet noticed, not because he was smarter, but because he occupied the position of overview. And that position changed how he understood genius. Genius, he realized, is not a solitary lightning bolt. It is an electric current, and a current is sound only when there is a proper circuit to carry it. Without a circuit, it is wasted energy. His role, at this moment in history, was to become that circuit. But circuits also heat up, and the more energy that flows through them, the hotter they become. Oppenheimer began to tire, not physically, but at a deeper level, tired from having to remain constantly alert, constantly balanced, continually preventing everything from tipping into chaos. He did not allow himself to collapse, because if the center collapsed, the entire structure would tremble. This was the silent price of coordinating genius. You are not allowed to be a genius in a spontaneous way. You must be the keeper of rhythm, and keeping rhythm, in music played too fast, is the most exhausting task of all. Los Alamos moved closer to its goal. The pieces began to align. Yesterday's impossibilities became today's problems. Oppenheimer saw this and also saw another truth. When collective intellect begins to operate smoothly, it no longer needs individual emotion. This was the moment when science began to resemble a complete machine. And once a machine is running, it does not stop simply because its coordinator feels uneasy. Oppenheimer sensed this intuitively. He knew his role was changing. From the connector, he became a driver, not driven by ambition, but because time no longer allowed slowing down. And with each push forward, a small ethical question was pushed a little further aside. No one at Los Alamos believed they were doing something wrong. They believed they were doing something necessary, and that sense of necessity was the most dangerous thing of all. In the next part, we will see what happens when this intellectual machine enters its final phase, when everything is measured in days, in hours, when the problem no longer allows for delay, when speed decisively overtakes conscience, as the night extends one more beat. Were the fastest decisions, they are also the heaviest ones. There are races with no clear starting line, and no finish line is worth celebrating. They have only a time, always one beat shorter than what human beings need in order to think. At Los Alamos, that race had begun long before. But only at this stage did it fully take shape. No longer distant hypotheses, no longer parallel options are weighed at a measured pace. Everything gradually converged toward a single direction, with one question hovering over every meeting: in time or too late? When time becomes the highest unit of measurement, morality does not disappear. It is postponed. No one at Los Alamos declared that ethics did not matter. They simply said it was not the moment to stop, not the moment to ask the larger questions, not the moment to look too far ahead, because every passing minute carried a quiet fear. If we move slower than others, the consequences will slip beyond control. Oppenheimer sensed this shift clearly. He saw how language changed, how debates shortened, how complex questions were compressed into milestones and deadlines. Science in this phase was no longer evaluated by the depth of thought, but by the speed of results. The bomb was designed as a problem to be solved, but it was a problem with no variable for conscience. This is the central paradox of this chapter, a profoundly human one. Because when faced with a significant threat, people are willing to accept solutions larger than their moral capacity, not because they wish to do harm, but because they believe something worse awaits if they do not act quickly enough. Oppenheimer stood inside this paradox with a sensation he knew well: intellect moving ahead, emotion struggling to keep pace. His intellect understood the logic of the race, understood that if one stopped to reflect, others would continue, understood that in this world, choice often belongs to those who act first. But his emotions, the part long compressed since Cambridge, since his inner crises, could not adjust to that speed. There were nights when the desert fell so silent that one could almost hear the sand shifting. Oppenheimer remained alone with diagrams, numbers, and assumptions. Everything made sense. Everything was consistent, and it was precisely that consistency that unsettled him, because when everything appears too rational, people often forget to ask, rational for whom? This race had no specific opponent, no face, no voice. The only adversary was time, and time shows no mercy. It does not care about hesitation. It does not care about sleepless nights. It does not care about the feeling that something is slipping beyond humanity's moral grasp. At this stage, Oppenheimer no longer had much room to remain the gentle coordinator he once was. He had to push, to shorten discussions, to choose what was good enough, instead of what was most correct. These decisions were not dramatic. They were made in brief sentences, in nods, in the silences of shared agreement. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. We are moving too fast to turn back. When science races against time, it learns a dangerous habit, treating everything that does not serve the goal as secondary. Ethics in such conditions is not rejected. It is suspended, like a debt promised to be paid later. But history shows that such debts are rarely settled in full. Oppenheimer began to feel a new distance between himself and the work he was doing. Not the distance of indifference, but the distance of awareness. He knew he was helping to create something far beyond the control of any individual, and although he still believed his presence might make it less terrible, that belief began to tremble under the weight of reality. There is a tiny, yet crucial moment in this race, the moment when people stop asking why and ask only when. When that moment arrives, the tracks are locked. All choices that follow are choices of speed, not direction. Los Alamos entered its final phase with an almost absolute focus. Sleepless minds grew even sharper. Minor errors were eliminated. Doubts were compressed. The intellectual machine ran with a smoothness that was frightening. And Oppenheimer, the man who once believed he could coordinate without being consumed, began to realize a brutal truth. You may stand at the center of the machine, but you cannot stop the gears with concern alone. A race against time does not allow gentleness. It does not allow turning back. It will enable only forward motion, with the hope that at the end of the path, there might still be space to return to the questions that were set aside. But time rarely gives back what it has taken. In the slow rhythm of the telling, this is a moment to pause, not to judge, but to feel the tension of intellect forced to outrun moral capacity, to feel the loneliness of someone who understands this, yet no longer holds the power to change the pace. Because in the next part, this race will no longer be abstract. It will converge on a specific moment, a morning, a light, an event after which not only Oppenheimer, but the entire world will be unable to return to its former state. As the night passes, one more beat, where time, at last, overtakes even reason. Dawn is usually associated with hope, but there are dawns that carry a different promise, that the world will never be the same again. The New Mexico desert before first light was so still, it felt as though time itself had paused. No cities, no crowds, only dry wind, fine sand, and a waiting stretched tight, like a breath held for too long. The people there did not speak much. No one needed to. Every central question had already been asked and set aside, because now only one question remained. Would it work? Trinity was not an emotional explosion. It was the convergence point of thousands of small decisions made across months without sleep. Every number, every option, every compromise with time led here. There was no retreat left, no if, only when. Oppenheimer stood there, not in the posture of a victor, nor of a destroyer. He stood as someone who had gone too far to turn back, yet remained lucid enough to know he was crossing a threshold. His intellect understood clearly. This was the logical result of every effort. His emotions lagged behind, heavier, slower, and not yet able to name what was unfolding. When the light erupted, it resembled nothing humanity had ever seen. Not fire, not lightning. It was an unseasonal dawn, rising from the ground rather than the horizon. In that instant, the desert became a silent stage where familiar categories, light and dark, near and far, before and after, were blurred together. No one cheered immediately. No one cried immediately. There was a brief, profound silence, as if the world itself were asking, what just happened? And in that silence, Oppenheimer felt a strange separation between two parts of himself. The intellectual part registered success. The human part stepped back, as though witnessing something beyond its capacity to contain. This was the moment when irreversibility became reality, no longer a concept. Before Trinity, there had still been an assumption that everything could be stopped. After Trinity, that assumption vanished, not because people no longer wished to stop, but because they had proven they could go all the way. Some saw that light and caught the end of a war. Others saw the beginning of a new era. Oppenheimer, in his private moment, saw both, and saw something else as well. Responsibility had moved beyond the reach of any individual. From this point on, the story no longer belonged to closed meetings, no longer to blackboards or deserts. It belonged to the world, and the world, once it had seen that light, could not forget, could not claim it had never known. Trinity did not end anxiety. It shaped it. It gave humanity a new measure of its own capacity, a measure far larger than the slow-growing rhythm of moral development. And within that mismatch, a question began to form quietly. Are we mature enough for this kind of power? Oppenheimer did not answer that question, not because he avoided it, but because he understood that no one could answer it in this moment. Emotions would come later, as they always had in his life. Elation, if it existed, came first. Understanding came later, and between the two lay a gap that people often fill with justification, with victory, with necessity. But that gap does not disappear. It only recedes, waiting for another moment to resurface. As the light faded, the desert returned to its familiar gray. But no one could see it as before. No one could say this had been just an experiment, because this experiment had changed how humanity thought about limits. And once limits are broken, the memory of them remains for a long time. In the slow cadence of deep sleep of power, this is not a climax to celebrate. It is the quietest point of the story, the point where words become excessive, where the truth is too large to be contained in any declaration. Oppenheimer, standing among those around him, suddenly felt alone in a way he knew well. Not lonely because no one understood, but because no one could fully share what he was feeling. Each person would carry that light into their own story. He, standing at the center of that intellectual network, had it as an imprint that could not be erased. From this moment forward, everything he did, everything he said, would be illuminated by the light of Trinity, not as a clear crime, not as a complete triumph, but as an irreversible reality. And as that dawn closed, another morning waited ahead, the morning of understanding that arrives too late, the morning when humanity begins to ask not what it can do, but what it has done. In the next part, we will enter the space between moment and meaning, between action and comprehension, between the blinding light and the words spoken long afterward. As the night settles, elation gives way to a question that will not sleep. There are sentences that do not arrive at the moment they are spoken. They arrive later, when emotion has finally caught up with intellect. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. When that sentence took shape in Oppenheimer's mind, Trinity was already behind him. The light had faded. The desert had returned to silence. But what lingered was not the sound of the explosion. It was its meaning, arriving slowly, heavily, and unavoidably. Any elation, if it existed at all, had come first. It came as a very human reflex after months of tension. We did it. A task that had seemed impossible was completed. The intellectual machine had run flawlessly to the final moment. Time, the only true enemy, had been defeated. But understanding does not arrive alongside success. It requires distance. And that distance for Oppenheimer began to open immediately after that false dawn. Death was not a declaration of pride, nor was it a complete confession. It was an attempt to find language for something that pure intellect could no longer contain. Oppenheimer reached for an ancient image, a line that lay beyond science because science, at this moment, offered him no words for what had just occurred. Equations do not speak of responsibility. Data does not speak of the soul. And in that void, he borrowed the voice of myth to name a feeling that had not yet fully taken shape. But naming is not the same as understanding. At this stage, Oppenheimer still could not see the entire road ahead. He knew a door had opened, but he could not yet imagine everything that would pass through it. As so many times before in his life, his intellect had moved ahead, and his emotions were still trying to catch up. There is a profound paradox here. The man who had just stood at the center of an event that changed the world felt his inner world slowing down. His emotions did not erupt. They settled, like water after a strong wind, calm in a way that feels uneasy. Oppenheimer continued to work, continued to appear, continued to speak with those who held decision-making power. He did not collapse. He did not shout. He did not turn away. And that very composure made everything more complicated, because tragedy did not arrive as a shock. It came as a slow absorption. Death, in its ancient context, is not merely a killer. It is a keeper of balance, a reminder that everything born carries its ending within it. Perhaps in borrowing that image, Oppenheimer was trying to say something he himself did not yet fully grasp. That from this moment on, science was no longer innocent. It had entered the role of a deciding force. But understanding that role is not the same as accepting it. In the days after Trinity, Oppenheimer began to feel a new distance between himself and those around him, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they were speaking about different things. Some spoke of victory, some of the strategies, some of the ways to end the war. And he, though he did not yet say it aloud, began to hear another question whispering inside him. And then what? That question had no clear place in meetings. It did not help with schedules. It did not serve objectives, and so it was set aside, just as ethics had once been set aside in the race against time. But being set aside does not mean disappearing. It simply waits for another context in which to return. Once again, Oppenheimer found himself in a familiar state, understanding too early, but not yet fully feeling. He knew what had happened could not be taken back, but he had not yet touched the full depth of its consequences. He had not yet seen specific cities, had not yet heard ordinary mornings torn apart, had not yet faced the gap between calculation and human life. The line about death, therefore, did not close the story. It opened a moral delay where meaning arrives after action and understanding arrives after success. That delay is one of the most frightening features of modern power, when we understand what we have done only after we no longer have the ability to stop. Oppenheimer began to sense a change within himself. He remained a coordinator. He remained a voice that carried weight. But that voice now bore a different gravity, lower, more hesitant, not because he had grown weaker, but because he had begun to look beyond the moment of victory. And when a person looks beyond victory, they often become unsettling to systems that care only about the present. In the slow cadence of deep sleep of power, this part is not meant to explain the famous line. It is intended to show that its meaning was never fully understood at the moment it was spoken, because the true meaning of Trinity does not lie in the blinding light, but in what that light illuminates, and in the long shadows it casts behind. Those shadows would soon leave the desert. They would cross oceans. They would reach cities with names, with children, with ordinary mornings. And When that happened, the distance between calculation and humanity would no longer be an abstract idea. In the next part, Oppenheimer will no longer stand before models. He will stand before consequences, not consequences on paper, but consequences with faces, with memories, with losses that cannot be measured by equations. As the night deepens, where understanding arrives too late, and no one can pretend any longer that they do not see. There are distances that cannot be measured in kilometers. They are measured by the silence that follows after everything has already happened. From the New Mexico desert, where a light once erupted like an unseasonal dawn, the story traveled very far. Across oceans, across maps, beyond closed meeting rooms, and then it reached cities with names, with mornings, with ordinary rhythms of life that had no time to realize the world had just shifted its axis. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. In reports, those names once appeared as markers, symbols on paper, coordinates circled in ink. From that distance, decisions looked tidy, rational, necessary. From that distance, war became an optimization problem. Shorten the timeline, reduce overall losses, and end it more quickly. But that distance was not a human distance. Morning in Hiroshima began like any other. Gentle light, hurrying footsteps, doors opening, and then, in a moment without a name, everything was pushed out of the orbit of memory. Not first by sound, but by total disorientation. Light arrived before noise. Heat arrived before understanding. Silence arrived before screams. Here, calculation was no longer numbers. It became torn apart. Oppenheimer was not there. He did not see the streets. He did not hear the voices. But geographical distance did not protect him from the moral distance now opening wide. Because what had occurred was no longer hypothetical. It had form. It had a smell. It had consequences that extended far beyond the instant itself. Nagasaki came afterward, and it was precisely this afterward that cut deeper. Because once something has happened, repeating it is no longer reflex. It is acceptance. Acceptance that humanity had entered an era where doing again what cannot be taken back had become possible. The distance between calculation and humanity here was not merely emotional. It was temporal. Calculation unfolds in sealed rooms where everything is compressed into objectives. Human beings live in continuous days where each morning carries habits, memories, and tiny hopes. When these two timelines collide, what shatters is not logic, but life. Oppenheimer began to feel this with a sensation he knew well, understanding arriving late. Not late because of missing information, but late because the heart requires time to catch up with what the intellect has long known. He understood that from this moment on, every argument of necessity would have to pass through a different door. The door of images, of memory, of stories that cannot be reduced. There are losses that cannot be balanced by statistics. There are harms that cannot be offset by objectives. From this distance, Oppenheimer spoke less. He listened. He listened to reports, to descriptions, to numbers read aloud in even tones. And between those streams of information, he heard something larger, a vast absence, the space where science had gone too far, beyond its ability to justify itself. Not everyone felt that absence as he did. For many, the war had to end. For many, the decision had been made under conditions without perfect choices. Those arguments were not wrong, but they did not touch the same layer. Because there is another layer, the layer of someone for whom consequences are no longer abstract. Oppenheimer stood between these two layers with a new kind of solitude. not the solitude of exclusion, but the solitude of no longer speaking the same language. The language of calculation speaks of efficiency, the language of humanity speaks of memory, and between those languages there is no perfect translation. This distance began to change him, quietly, without drama, persistently. He did not deny what had been done. He did not cast himself as a victim, but he began to ask questions, not questions meant to reverse the past, but questions intended to prevent a future governed by the same logic. Here, a subtle shift becomes visible. From coordinator of genius to bearer of uncomfortable questions. The questions were no longer about what could be done, but about where one should stop. And in systems accustomed to operating by speed, such questions are unwelcome. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in this slow telling, are not invoked to detail catastrophe. They are invoked as points of intersection, where science is forced to look into a mirror, and where humanity is forced to admit that its capacity has outpaced its moral maturity. The distance between calculation and humanity, from this point on, is no longer abstract. It becomes a fissure running through the age itself. A fissure that Oppenheimer, though he did not create it alone, felt with particular clarity. And when a person feels such a fissure clearly, they often become inconvenient, not because they betray what was done, but because they refuse to remain silent about what follows. In the next part, that inconvenience will take on a concrete form, not in the desert, not in distant cities, but within the very space of power, where those who once invited him to the center begin to realize he is no longer saying what they want to hear. As the night deepens one more beat, where the distance between calculation and humanity begins to become the distance between Oppenheimer and power. There are roles that exist only for a moment, and there are people who cannot remain inside those roles, even when they carry the name of glory. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Oppenheimer was spoken of in generous titles: a hero of science, the architect of victory, the public face of an intellect that had helped bring the war to an end. Those words were repeated steadily, familiarly, like a protective shell, shielding the collective from having to think any deeper. But beneath that shell, a quiet misalignment continued to grow. Oppenheimer did not betray his country, nor did he turn his back on science. He did only one thing that power finds difficult to tolerate. He asked questions too early. In a world just emerging from war, the question, what comes next, was unwelcome. People wanted stability, order, the reassurance that what had been done was necessary and therefore did not need to be dissected further. At that moment, questioning was seen as a disruption of a fragile consensus. But Oppenheimer could not stop at that consensus. He had seen the process from beginning to end. He had stood at the center of the machine. He had felt the delay between action and meaning, and because of that, he understood something unsettling. If no one voiced the uncomfortable truths, the machine would keep running, next time faster, more powerful, and with even less hesitation. The discomfort began very quietly, a cautious recommendation, a pause before new plans, an unfinished sentence about limits. No one accused him outright, they simply listened less. Oppenheimer began to notice that he was speaking in rooms where the air felt colder than before. The eyes around the table no longer sought guidance, they measured inconvenience. He did not lose scientific credibility, he lost usefulness. And in the world of power, that is a dangerous loss, because power prefers those who solve problems, not those who reopen them. From the center of victory, Oppenheimer was gradually pushed to the margins of significant decisions. There were no announcements, no declarations, just meetings he was no longer invited to. Plans were finalized before he could speak. New projects were outlined at a speed that made hesitation look like obstruction. He did not rebel. He did not shout. He stayed and continued to speak, slowly, clearly, refusing to make peace with silence. It was precisely that persistence that made him most inconvenient. There is a bitter paradox here. The man once chosen for his ability to see the entire picture was now set aside for seeing too much. Power was needed when it was required, speed and organization. But once a chosen trajectory had to be maintained, it required much more than vision. Oppenheimer felt this shift clearly, not with anger, but with a profound, steady fatigue. He understood that he was entering another role, unwanted yet unavoidable, the role of the reminder. A reminder that power does not limit itself. A reminder that precedents, once created, do not disappear. A reminder that yesterday's victory can become tomorrow's catastrophe if it is not held within a wide enough moral frame. Such reminders are not rewarded. They are remembered, and the memory of power rarely carries a positive meaning. From hero, Oppenheimer slowly became an inconvenience, not because he opposed, but because he no longer fit the official story. The story needed a clean ending. He kept opening ellipses. There were nights when, no longer called into grand plans, Oppenheimer returned to himself, to an old question, now heavier than before. What is the responsibility of the one who sees? To remain silent in order to keep position, or to speak in order to keep conscience? He had once chosen involvement to maintain control. Now he chose speech to prevent repetition. The cost of that choice did not arrive all at once. It came gradually, like a wall built from small details. Suspicion, surveillance, questions about motives. No one said he was a traitor. They simply asked, is he still trustworthy? And once that question is asked, everything changes. In the slow rhythm of deep sleep of power, this part is not meant to cast Oppenheimer as a victim. He was not pushed aside because he was right. He was pushed aside because being right was no longer the priority. The priority was stability, order, continuation, without lingering too long on what lay behind. Oppenheimer understood this, and that understanding only deepened his isolation, because he knew that not looking back does not erase the past. It merely allows the future to repeat the same logic with more powerful tools. From hero to inconvenience, this was not a sudden fall. It was a gradual slide where each step made sense in isolation. Only when viewed as a whole does the slope reveal itself as something long prepared. In the next part, that inconvenience will no longer remain a feeling. It will take form, procedure, official decisions. When power no longer needs science in the same way, and when science, if it does not comply, is pushed back into sealed rooms. As the night deepens one more beat, where silence becomes organized and reputation begins to be dismantled piece by piece. There is a tranquil moment in the lives of those who once stood close to the center of power. Not the moment of being overthrown, but the moment when they are no longer asked for their opinion. Power does not say goodbye. It simply changes its habits. For Oppenheimer, this shift did not arrive as a dramatic shock. It came through small details, repeated often enough to form a new reality. Meetings held without his name on the list. Decisions were made before he had time to read the drafts. Invitations that had once been urgent were becoming polite, distant, and increasingly rare. No one declared that science was no longer critical. They simply acted as if science no longer needed to be listened to. By this stage, power had learned what it needed from science. It had tasted the effectiveness of mobilizing collective intelligence. It had learned how to organize, accelerate, and deliver results. And once that lesson was internalized, the teacher no longer needed to stand nearby. Science, from the partner, became a finished tool. Oppenheimer understood this not with indignation, but with a clear-eyed sadness. He realized that his role, the one who asked questions, who looked ahead, who reminded others of consequences, no longer fit the new phase. A phase in which power wanted stability rather than reflection, continuation rather than pauses for thought. And when power no longer needs science, it begins to narrow science's space. That space is not destroyed. It is returned to closed rooms, to expert committees whose voices no longer reach the final decision. Science is still allowed to exist, so long as it does not disturb the order that has been established. Oppenheimer, once chosen for seeing the entire picture, was now asked to look at a smaller corner. And when he refused to shrink his vision, power did what it knows best. It questioned his trustworthiness. Clearance revoked. Reputation dismantled. Not through loud accusations, but through procedure. Procedure is power's preferred language when it wants to silence without causing disruption. Everything is presented as necessary, lawful, and properly conducted. There is no explicit moral judgment, only documents, signatures, and hearings where truth is broken into disconnected fragments. Oppenheimer stood before these procedures with a strange sensation. He was no longer arguing about science. He was arguing about character, about motives, about loyalty, things science had never taught him how to prove. This was a fall without sound. No crowd, no spotlight, just a man who had once stood at the center of the century, now placed in a defensive position, not because he was wrong, but because he was no longer convenient. When power no longer needs science, it also no longer needs uncomfortable questions. It requires the calm of a settled narrative. And Oppenheimer, with his too vivid memory of what had happened, became a ripple on a surface others wanted smooth. He did not resist by appealing for sympathy, nor did he turn himself into a symbol of protest. He endured, like someone who understands that power is not always defeated by reason. There were evenings when Oppenheimer returned to a familiar silence. No desert, no conference rooms, only thoughts circling again and again. What had changed and what had not? He saw clearly that science remained powerful, more powerful than ever. But the relationship between science and power had shifted. Science was no longer a partner to be heard. It had become a resource already extracted. And when a resource has been sufficiently exploited, it is either controlled or set aside. In the slow cadence of deep sleep of power, this part is not meant to depict personal injustice. It is intended to illuminate a broader rule. Power needs intelligence only until it learns how to operate on its own. After that, intelligence becomes a variable to be managed. Oppenheimer understood this rule through direct experience. And because he understood it, he no longer tried to return to the center. He withdrew, not in bitterness, but in a late-arriving clarity. He knew that there are moments in history when the most critical question is not, how do we win, but how do we live with the consequences? When power no longer needs science, science still exists. But it exists in silence, in closed rooms, in people who remember very clearly what happened when silence was once broken. And within that silence, something else begins to form. Not an ending, but a legacy. Not the legacy of victory, but the legacy of an unanswered question. In the final part, we will not find a complete resolution, only a settling, a looking back that seeks neither condemnation nor absolution, but leaves the question in place, like a lullaby that does not close. As the night passes one final beat, where history lowers its voice and the question is left alone, to echo long after. When a story reaches its final passage, history no longer needs to speak loudly. It lowers its voice, it slows down, and it stops searching for a neat conclusion, because some lives do not close with an answer, but with a question deep enough to remain. J. Robert Oppenheimer changed the world, not through a single moment, but through a long chain of consecutive choices. Choices made under pressure. Choices shaped by the belief that intelligence, if placed at the center, could make things less terrible. And then once everything had gone too far, it was that very intelligence that first recognized the truth. The world does not belong to those who create it. There was no Nobel Prize to close this story. No complete apology from history. Only a man who withdrew into silence, carrying the memory of having seen too early and of not being able to stop in time. Oppenheimer is not condemned in this story, nor is he absolved, because history rarely operates through clear verdicts, operates through consequences, and the consequences of intelligence, once it outpaces ethics, do not seek out a single individual to bear them. They spread, they settle, and they remain embedded in the structure of the world. In the later years of his life, Oppenheimer no longer stood at the center of power. He did not command. He did not coordinate. He did not drive progress forward. He read. He reflected. He spoke more slowly. And in that slowness we see something profoundly human. Only when power recedes does a person begin to truly listen to themselves. Perhaps that is when intelligence and emotion finally meet, not to reconcile the past, but to live with it. People often ask, did Oppenheimer regret it? But that question simplifies a life that was anything but simple. Regret implies that there is a way back. Oppenheimer lived in a world that had already proven there was none. He did not deny what he had done, but neither did he stop reminding others that power, once created, must be held within a framework of responsibility larger than any individual. He understood, through his own experience, that intelligence does not carry ethics by default, and power does not limit itself. That is his true legacy, not the bomb, not the temporary city in the desert, but the unanswered question, when science becomes powerful enough to change the world, who takes responsibility for that change? This question is not meant to accuse one person. It is intended to awaken collective vigilance, because in the age after Oppenheimer, power no longer resides in a single project. It is dispersed, replicated. It appears in more closed rooms, with more refined tools, and at far greater speed. And for that very reason, the question must be preserved. In the slow rhythm of deep sleep of power, we do not end this story with applause or outrage. We end it with stillness, by allowing the listener to carry away a feeling. Not the feeling of an answer, but the feeling of responsibility, because power is formed from memory that has been stripped away, and only when memory is preserved can power be brought into the light. Oppenheimer lived long enough to see himself move from being invited to being kept at a distance, from center to periphery, from a symbol of victory to an uncomfortable reminder. And that journey reveals a profound truth. The world accepts intelligence only until intelligence begins to question the world itself. Those who change the world do not own it. They touch a moment, and that moment moves on, carrying consequences no one can fully control. In the deep of night, as the voice slows, this story does not ask you to judge. It only invites you to remain with the question, to stay with the feeling that progress does not always mean maturity. The ability to go further does not guarantee readiness. And perhaps that is history's final lullaby, not to conclude, but to remind us that every generation must relearn how to live with the power it creates. As the lights fade, as the breathing slows, the question does not need to be answered now. It only needs to remain.